The year is 1953. The world has just stepped into the dawn of a new year. World War II, 8 years ago, came to an end with the capitulation of the German Reich. The Cold War is now in full swing. But, as this year would show, there are much larger things we should be worried about than nuclear annihilation.
Off the coast of Iceland, a monster was being born. Seen by some as something not to be concerned about, it would soon shake the foundations of recovering nations. What this storm would bring is a disaster seen like no other at the time. The Dutch would come to know it as the Watersnoodramp. In the UK, it would be known as the North Sea Flood. In this two-part documentary, I hope to cover the two most affected countries by the storm and floods. Both were wrecked by it, but both have taken two very different approaches to preventing this disaster from ever happening again. In this episode, I hope to cover the United Kingdom side of the disaster. What happened, what was its effects, and what was the impact in the aftermath. I also hope to look at how this storm emerged, and just what made it so dangerous to go on and cause the disaster it did.
The year is 1953. This will be one of the most famous years in history.
The Korean armistice will be signed, bringing a halt to the Korean War. The United Kingdom will have a new queen in Elizabeth II. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, will die, and a political chess game in the Soviet Union will begin as the race to become leader starts.
But before any of that occurs, Europe, a continent less than a decade ago embroiled in World War II, is still reeling from the effects of it. But nature's got other plans. She's winding up for a punch, and it's going to be a big one.
On the 29th of January, a new storm system was forming off the south coast of Iceland. Over the next couple of days, it would migrate southwest. But storms then obviously are nothing new, so what was really special about this one? There were three key factors that would make this storm one to remember. First, this storm had real intensity. It raged on a gale force 11 to 12, producing gusts of 83 miles per hour or 135 kilometers an hour. Wind, of course, creates waves. This is because of friction between the water's surface and air particles. The stronger the wind, the bigger the waves. The second was the high spring tide. This is a regular phenomenon occurring on the full or new moon cycle. At this point, the moon is closest to Earth, and thus the pull of the moon's gravity is a lot stronger, pulling the sea up and inland more than it usually would. Thirdly is pressure. You may be wondering what pressure has to do with this. Well, pressure, it can be quite a complicated thing, and I myself also get confused sometimes about how the whole thing works. So here's a bit of a demonstration to sort of explain how pressure was dangerous on that night. So in front of me I've got my plate, and inside I've got some water. That's basically representing the North Sea. I've got my candle, that's only there to heat up the air. Now, if I take this glass and put it on top of the candle, what then starts to happen is the candle heats up the air particles inside the glass. These particles get filled with more energy, move around a lot more and take up more space. This creates an area of high pressure in the glass. But once the candle goes out, those particles expend the energy and cool down. They now start to shrink and they take up a lot less space. Now we have an area of low pressure inside of the glass. This means now we've got low pressure in our glass, but the pressure outside the glass is a lot higher. Now, nature likes to equalize this, but we've got this vacuum. So what happens is the water moves into the glass to equalize this pressure. And that's basically what happened in 1953. As the storm was moving over the North Sea, air rose rapidly. Now this creates an area of low pressure around the sea. The sea and other air particles moved in to try and equalize this pressure. So in large areas, the sea rose by a number of meters to try and help equalize the pressure. And now, once you understand that, you can understand how dangerous
low pressure environments are, especially on that night.
These three ingredients were the ingredients for a hazard of biblical proportions, one that would go on to cause a disaster, the likes of which had not been seen for decades. On the morning of Saturday, the 31st of January 1953, the passenger ferry Princess Victoria left her moorings in Stranraer, Scotland, for her regular trip across the Irish Sea. She'd been warned previously about gales, but it was nothing necessarily out of the ordinary. Yet, it was not long before the Victoria ran into trouble. Colossal waves crashed over her deck, tossing the ship around helplessly. Despite the crew's best efforts, the order was given to abandon ship. Unfortunately, out of her 179 passengers and crew, 133 lost their lives. Sadly, these would not be the storm's last victims.
This really should have been a wake-up call, especially to the UK and to local communities on the east and the southeast coast. But unfortunately, this was not going to be the case. You see, the UK does have flood and storm defences at this point in time, but they are very basic. Any sort of funding to these projects has been moved into reconstruction and construction, especially after the war's end. So what you're left with at this point in time is, yeah, you've got flood defences and storm defences, but they're very basic and in some cases in a very dilapidated state. The UK as well at this point in time doesn't have an emergency warning system. Anything it does have that may resemble that is very slow and completely inefficient.
The storm's continued ferocity finally led to roughly 1,200 sea defences being breached. The water began to surge inland. Areas in the southeast of England were heavily affected. Residents in the counties of Lincolnshire, Kent, Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk awoke to find themselves completely inundated by water. The storm surge averaged 3.35 metres above sea level, with some waves reaching over 5 metres tall. Indeed, in Norfolk, waves higher than 7 metres were recorded. Large swathes of the east and the southeast coast were flooded, a total of 140,000 acres of land. Canvey Island, east of London, was badly affected. Out of the total 307 who died in this disaster, 58 of them came from Canvey. An additional 32,000 people were evacuated from affected areas, with some not returning to their homes for months afterwards. Tens of thousands of homes and businesses were either damaged or completely destroyed. Counties most affected were rural farming areas. Many people lost their livelihoods, with roughly 46,000 livestock perishing as well. The financial cost came to £50 million, which equates to just over 1.2 billion in today's money. Local communities were destroyed. People lost friends and family. Some lost whole neighbourhoods. Prime Minister Winston Churchill stated in an address that the events were shocking and tragic, and "We are resolved that the nation shall do everything within its power to make good the distress which this sudden disaster has brought to so many thousands of our fellow countrymen." A familiar voice that had been a symbol of hope before would be again. Churchill declared Operation Floodlight. This was a massive aerial reconnaissance operation. Over the following 2 weeks, the Royal Air Force in Mosquitoes and Lancasters flew over 70 flights and took 200,000 photographs. These photos were then taken to the Joint Air Photographic Intelligence Centre, where they were studied and interpreted, and a comprehensive report was filed. These reports recorded damaged infrastructure, homes, and industry. They also included a small map. This map was coloured, displaying most affected areas. These reports were then sent to government agencies and bodies, compiling where most damaged areas were and what they advised to fix first in each area. This operation allowed agencies to respond quickly and provide vital detail to aid in reconstruction efforts. In all, it took 9 months for all the repairs to be made and for all the seawater to be drained from affected areas. The whole episode had left mental and physical scars on affected communities. On the north coast of Kent, the historical site of Reculver required considerable amount of work, as the storm had left massive gaping scars in the cliff, leaving it vulnerable to collapse. There was a desperate need to repair rudimentary coastal defences that also once stood there. After the disaster, an extensive report was compiled by the government. This report indicated that improvements in the storm defences on the east and the southeast coast of England were vital to prevent a repeat disaster. Probably the most famous of these defences is situated in London. The Thames Flood Barrier. Built in 1984 to protect central London from coastal flooding and storms, this project cost £461 million, around £1.23 billion in today's money. But the barrier is already more than halfway through its expected lifespan. Authorities are having to look to build a new barrier further outside of London to replace the old one. But at the end of all this, the bigger question is whether the UK is ready and suitably equipped. With climate change making more and more of an impact, extreme weather occurring more frequently, and potential hazards more serious, you have to wonder whether the UK is prepared, or can we expect a repeat of the past?